The music was soft that night, the kind that lingers in the air like a memory you don't want to fade. Under the golden lights of the ballroom, Jonathan Reed stood still, a glass untouched in his hand, watching her. Emily Carter, his assistant, his quiet anchor through 3 long years, was dancing. But not with him. The man holding her was someone else. Someone who made her laugh in a way Jonathan had never managed to. Her face was lit with something rare, freedom. And for the first time in his well-calculated life, Jonathan felt something break through the armor he'd built, a strange ache that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with loss. He'd spent years mastering control over his company, his time, his emotions. But that night, watching her spin in another man's arms, he realized control had never kept him safe. It had only kept him alone. The waltz ended. Applause filled the hall, and Emily turned her eyes, meeting his across the crowd. For a moment, neither of them smiled, because both knew something had changed, and it could never go back. This is the story of what happens when a man who feels nothing finally feels too much, and how one quiet woman taught him that sometimes. Love begins where pride ends. The morning light filtered through the glass walls of Reed Technologies, turning the polished floor into a river of gold. Everything in Jonathan Reed's world was ordered desks aligned by the inch, reports color-coded by department, and meetings timed to the second. Even silence had a schedule here. The steady click of keyboards filled the open office like rainfall, predictable, efficient, distant. From behind the frosted glass of his corner suite, Jonathan watched the city stretch awake beneath him. Cars moved in slow lines. People hurried with coffee cups in hand, chasing something invisible. He admired that purpose, precision. What he didn't notice, or rather, refused to notice, was how lonely it all sounded. At exactly 7:58, the elevator doors opened. Emily Carter stepped out, her hands clutching a thin laptop and a paper cup. Her coat was still damp from the drizzle outside, her hair tied neatly but not perfectly, a single strand brushed against her cheek. She moved through the hallway quietly, greeting the receptionist with a soft smile before disappearing into Jonathan's office. "Morning," she said, placing a new stack of files on his desk. Her voice was calm, low, the kind of tone that never demanded attention but always carried it. Jonathan didn't look up right away. "You're 2 minutes early." Emily smiled faintly. Traffic was kind. It wasn't a conversation, not really. It never was. But somehow, between them, silence worked better than words. For 3 years, they had built an empire of efficiency together. She, the quiet compass. He, the relentless force that moved everything forward. She knew the rhythm of his thoughts before he spoke them, the way his brow furrowed when a problem didn't make sense, the way he tapped his pen twice when he was close to a decision. And he, though he would never admit it, had grown to depend on her calm in a way that unsettled him. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Inside, the air between them carried something unspoken respect, maybe admiration, though neither would name it. Jonathan valued results, not people, or at least, that's what he told himself. Around noon, the first crack appeared in the day's smooth rhythm. Emily's phone vibrated quietly. She hesitated before picking it up, her face tightening just slightly, the kind of subtle shift only someone who watched too closely would notice. Jonathan did. "Everything all right?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes. My mother's nurse just texted. She's fine. Just a small fever. It'll pass." Then she smiled, quick and practiced, and returned to her notes. But Jonathan saw it the way her hand lingered near her phone, the quiet worry she tried to swallow. He wanted to say something kind, something that might ease her mind. But kindness wasn't a language he was fluent in. So, instead, he said what he always said. "We have a meeting in 10, that night, long after most of the staff had left. The office was still glowing with the pale light of computer screens. Jonathan stood by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reviewing numbers that no longer meant anything. Behind him, Emily was finishing up the day's reports. She stifled a yawn, her eyes tired. "Go home," he he said without turning around. I will. After I send this. You've said that every night this week. She gave a quiet laugh. And every night, I mean it. The sound of her laughter was soft, like something he'd forgotten he missed. He turned, studying her in the reflection of the glass. Emily was not striking in the way people noticed at first glance, but there was something steady, luminous, about her presence, the kind of beauty that didn't demand space. It simply filled it. When she finally gathered her things, she paused by the door. You should go home too. Mr. Reed. He looked at her, brow lifting slightly. I am home. Her eyes softened not in pity, but in quiet understanding. That's the saddest thing I've heard all week. Then she left. The room fell silent again. But it wasn't the comfortable silence they usually shared. It was heavier, like the moment before a storm. Jonathan sat back in his chair, her words echoing faintly in the air. He glanced at his reflection in the window, the sharp suit, the tired eyes, the life made of order and numbers. He'd built everything to be untouchable, yet somehow, one woman with a paper cup and a tired smile had managed to walk right through the walls. He didn't know it yet, but that quiet remark, that's the saddest thing I've heard all week, had left a mark. A small one, perhaps, but it was enough. Enough to make him notice how empty his world sounded when she wasn't in it. Outside, the city lights flickered like distant stars. Inside. Jonathan closed his laptop, something he rarely did before midnight. For once, he didn't feel like calculating the next quarter or checking projections. He just sat there, listening to the faint echo of her footsteps fading down the hallway, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the logic, beneath the control, a thought surfaced. Quiet but persistent. Maybe silence wasn't always peace. Sometimes, it was just loneliness, pretending to be strength. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow night, at a gala filled with laughter and music, that silence would finally break. The ballroom shimmered beneath a canopy of golden light. Music drifted through the air, slow, elegant, the kind of melody that filled the spaces between conversations. Jonathan Reed stood near the edge of the crowd, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, his reflection fractured across the surface of the crystal. He wasn't used to these events, though his name was printed on every banner, his company logo etched on the silver stage backdrop. Fundraising galas were for networking, not feeling. Yet tonight, feeling came uninvited. Emily was there. He saw her before she saw him, across the sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits. She wore a navy dress that brushed the floor when she moved, her hair loosely pinned, a few strands catching the light each time she turned. It wasn't the first time Jonathan had seen her in a dress, but something about tonight was different. She looked free, unmeasured, unafraid of being seen. He was still watching when another man approached her, tall, charming, his smile easy, his presence confident without trying. Jonathan caught the name as they shook hands. Lucas Miller, a name he didn't know, but instantly disliked. Lucas said something that made Emily laugh, not the polite, quiet laugh she gave at work, but one that broke open like sunlight. That sound caught Jonathan off guard. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard her laugh like that. Maybe never. The orchestra shifted to a waltz, and without hesitation, Lucas extended his hand. Emily hesitated for only a heartbeat before she took it. They stepped into the soft rhythm, her movements light, graceful, her smile genuine. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He told himself it was nothing a dance, a social gesture, but as the two of them moved in perfect time, something sharp settled beneath his ribs. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was something quieter, stranger, the realization that he'd spent 3 years beside her without ever really seeing her. And now, someone else was... He tried to look away, but his eyes refused. Every turn of her dress, every glint of light against her skin seemed to pull him closer into the discomfort of his own stillness. He, the man who planned every move, now stood frozen, watching as her life spun just out of reach. A colleague passed by and said something about the success of the event, about donors and numbers. Jonathan nodded automatically, not hearing a word. His gaze drifted back toward the dance floor. Lucas leaned close to say something, and Emily threw her head back in laughter again. Jonathan's pulse spiked. His fingers tightened around the glass until the ice inside cracked with a sound too loud for the moment. Someone nearby glanced his way. He set the glass down, pretending it was too warm to drink. For the first time, he noticed the ache of envy, not just for the man who danced with her, but for the ease that man had, for the way Emily seemed weightless beside him, unburdened by expectations, unshadowed by his own rules. He remembered the words she had said the night before. "That's the saddest thing I've heard all week." He had brushed it off then, but now, standing there among the glitter and the laughter, he understood what she meant. It wasn't sadness that filled him now. It was emptiness, the quiet, merciless kind. The song ended with a final sweep of violins. Applause echoed through the room like a tide. Lucas bowed playfully. Emily curtsied with a smile. When she looked up, her eyes caught Jonathan's across the crowd. The smile faded. For a moment, they stood separated by people, by music, by everything unspoken between them. Her gaze softened, then drifted away. And she turned back to Lucas as another song began. Jonathan felt something shift inside him, subtle, irreversible, the kind of shift that makes a man aware of the life he's been sleepwalking through. He wanted to leave, to reclaim control before the ache grew worse. But his feet stayed planted, his heart refusing the logic his mind demanded. He watched her for a moment longer, the gentle curve of her hand on Lucas's shoulder, the way her laughter lit up the dim corners of the hall, the way he suddenly wished it were him there, saying the right words, doing the right thing, being someone she could look at the same way. The orchestra swelled again. He turned away before the next dance began. Outside the ballroom, the night air was cool against his skin, a relief and a punishment all at once. He walked toward the terrace, where the city spread out below, a mosaic of lights and motion. Somewhere in that maze of streets, people were living, loving, fighting, forgiving, real things, things he'd forgotten how to feel. Behind him, laughter drifted through the open doors, hers among them, faint but distinct. Jonathan closed his eyes. For years, he had believed emotions were distractions, inefficiencies to be managed. But tonight, as music and memory tangled in his chest, he realized something far more dangerous. He wasn't built to be untouched. He was simply scared of being broken. He stayed on the terrace until the music inside softened into murmurs. When he finally turned to leave, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass door, a man surrounded by success, yet utterly alone. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of pride and reason, something began to crack. And though he didn't know it yet, that single fracture born from one quiet dance would be the beginning of everything that came undone. The night air was cool against Jonathan's face when he stepped back inside. The gola was still alive with music, but softer now, slower. Conversations had shifted into low murmurs, laughter wrapped in the kind of warmth that came after too much champagne. He hadn't planned to return. He could have left and no one would have noticed. But something pulled him back, maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe her. Emily stood near the edge of the dance floor, speaking with one of the marketing directors. Her posture was easy, but her eyes carried the kind of alertness that never really left her, even in moments meant for joy. When she caught sight of him, her smile flickered polite, cautious, the way people smile at something they don't know how to name anymore. She excused herself and began walking toward him. Each step felt too deliberate, too measured. The space between them once effortless now, heavy with everything unsaid. "Mr. Reed," she greeted softly, her tone even professional. "I didn't think you'd still be here." He hesitated, searching for something ordinary to say, but the words came out sharper than he meant. "I had business to discuss. I didn't realize this was social hour for the staff." Emily's eyes flickered just a second of surprise, then quiet hurt. "It's a company event. she replied gently. Everyone was encouraged to come. I saw you dancing. The words slipped before he could stop them. They hung there, colder than he intended, with that man. That man, she repeated, her voice low but steady. Lucas? He's an old friend. He donated to the foundation tonight. Jonathan nodded stiffly. It looked personal. She tilted her head, studying him, as if trying to understand what this conversation really was. It wasn't, she said after a pause. But even if it was, I don't think that's part of my job description. Is it? The air between them thinned. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed the sound too bright, too alive for the tension pressing down on them. Jonathan felt his throat tighten, though he didn't know why. He wanted to explain himself, to say that he hadn't meant to sound possessive, that he was just caught off guard. But the instinct to protect his pride was stronger. Of course, he said finally. You're free to do whatever you wish outside office hours. Emily let out a small breath, one that might have been a laugh if it hadn't sounded so tired. You know, you have this way of making freedom sound like a reprimand. He looked at her, then really looked at the calm in her eyes that covered a flicker of sadness. She wasn't angry, not truly, just disappointed. That, somehow, felt worse. I didn't mean he began, but she stopped him with a slight shake of her head. It's fine, she said quietly. You don't have to explain. You don't owe me that. Her gaze softened, the edges of her voice turning almost tender. But you also don't get to control my life, Jonathan. You don't get to decide who I dance with. He froze. She had never called him by his first name before. It landed somewhere deep inside him, unfamiliar and startling, like hearing his own name spoken in a language he didn't understand. Her words weren't cruel. They were just true. And truth had a way of cutting deeper than anger ever could. For a moment, he wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't understand that what he felt wasn't control. It was something else, something he didn't know how to name. But the silence that followed left no room for defense. She gave him a small, sad smile. You spend so much of your life managing things, but people aren't projects. Jonathan, they're not supposed to fit into your plans. Then, with the same quiet grace she carried through every day at the office, Emily turned and walked away. He watched her go through the crowd, past the glittering lights, until she disappeared into the noise. The orchestra began another song, slow and wistful. Jonathan remained still, surrounded by the illusion of celebration, laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of success. None of it reached him. All he could hear was the echo of her voice. You don't get to decide who I dance with. He stayed there for a long time, until the crowd began to thin and waiters started clearing tables. The whiskey from earlier still sat untouched on the corner table. The ice melted into water. He picked it up but didn't drink. The reflection staring back at him in the glass looked unfamiliar. A man stripped of certainty. For years, Jonathan Reed had prided himself on his ability to separate emotion from logic. He believed that distance kept him safe, that caring too much blurred judgment. Yet tonight, one simple dance had undone that illusion. He didn't know if what he felt was jealousy or fear or both. He only knew that when Emily had looked at him, not as her boss, but as a man, something in his chest had shifted, like a lock turning in its place. Outside, the city was quiet again. The air smelled faintly of rain, the streets glistening beneath the streetlights. Jonathan stepped out, his shoes clicking against the marble steps, each sound too loud in the silence. He paused at the edge of the sidewalk, staring into the night, replaying her words in his mind, not her tone, not her sadness, but the way she said his name, Jonathan. It wasn't a rebuke. It wasn't even anger. It was real, and maybe that's what frightened him most. He slipped his hands into his pockets, exhaled slowly, and walked toward his car. Somewhere behind him, the ballroom lights flickered off one by one, fading into the kind of darkness that didn't feel empty, just uncertain. And in that quiet uncertainty, he realized something he'd never let himself admit before. He cared, and caring, he thought, might be the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. Morning arrived too soon. The city outside was still waking, soft light spilling through the blinds of Jonathan's office. He sat behind his desk earlier than usual, the quiet hum of the building pressing against his thoughts. Normally, silence was his ally, predictable, obedient. But today, it carried weight, the kind that made breathing feel like work. At precisely 8 o'clock, the elevator doors opened. He didn't need to look up to know it was her. He felt it, the soft rhythm of her steps, the faint rustle of paper against her arm. Emily entered, as she always did, calm, efficient, impossibly composed. She placed the day's schedule on his desk, her voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." He lifted his eyes briefly. "Morning," that was all. 2 syllables, clean and empty. The kind of words meant to maintain peace when there's too much beneath them to say aloud. She didn't linger, didn't wait for acknowledgement. She returned to her desk outside his office, where her fingers moved quietly over the keyboard. Through the glass wall between them, Jonathan could see her reflection, her posture straight, her hair neatly pulled back, not a trace of the woman who had stood in that ballroom under golden lights, not a trace of the smile that had undone him. He tried to focus on the report in front of him, market projections, partnership figures, performance metrics, things that once defined his world, but the numbers blurred. Every few minutes, his gaze drifted toward the glass. Emily typed without pause, but her shoulders seemed tenser than usual, her eyes a little dimmer. He told himself he was imagining it, yet the truth lingered like a bruise. Something between them had shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough to make everything feel slightly off balance. By mid-morning, the office buzzed with its usual rhythm. Phones rang, conversations hummed, meetings began and ended. Life, as far as anyone could see, was normal. But Jonathan could feel the undercurrent of discomfort. The air around them was too polite, too careful. Even the way she handed him files was different, no longer effortless, but measured, almost distant. Once, they had shared a quiet language. Small things, a nod, a half smile, a wordless understanding of what the other needed. Now, every exchange was scripted, every silence deliberate. At one point, he caught himself almost saying her name, just to see what it would sound like now, but he stopped. He didn't know how to start a conversation without breaking whatever fragile balance they were pretending to keep. He tried again to bury himself in work. He reviewed the upcoming product launch, analyzed a proposal, even dictated a few memos, but nothing stuck. Every time his pen moved, his mind returned to her words from last night. "You don't get to decide who I dance with." He'd heard plenty of defiance in his life from rivals, employees, board members, but this wasn't defiance. It was truth, simple, quiet, and piercing. Around noon, he heard the soft click of her chair through the glass. He watched as she grabbed her coat and walked toward the elevator. Lunch break, he told himself. Perfectly normal. Still, something in him stirred. A few minutes later, he found himself standing at the window, watching the street below. He spotted her easily, that navy coat, the steady stride. She stopped by the cafe across the street, her movements efficient, familiar. But then another figure joined her, a man. Lucas. The same easy smile, the same confident air that had irritated Jonathan the night before. They stood talking by the window, the light catching on her hair as she laughed. That same laugh again, not forced, not polite, real. Jonathan turned away before he could feel the rest of it. Jealousy wasn't an emotion he respected. It was messy, primitive, beneath him. Yet here it was, steady as a pulse. When Emily returned an hour later, he didn't look up. She placed a file on his desk, her tone neutral. "These are the revised projections for Q4. Thank you," he said, his voice calm, too calm. She nodded once and started to leave, but something in him rebelled against the distance. "How was your lunch?" he asked, without thinking. Her hand froze on the folder she was carrying. A pause. "Good," she said after a moment. "Just met an old friend." He nodded, pretending that was enough. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask again. The silence stretched until it felt like glass clear, thin, and ready to shatter at the slightest touch. The rest of the day unfolded in quiet motions. Work continued, deadlines approached. From the outside, everything appeared seamless. But between them, something fragile had cracked. As evening crept in, most of the staff began leaving. Jonathan remained, as he often did, surrounded by the glow of computer screens. Emily gathered her things, standing in the doorway for a moment. "Good night, Mr. Reed." He looked up. Her eyes met his, briefly polite, unreadable. "Good night, Emily." She gave a faint nod, then turned away. When the elevator doors closed behind her, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The office felt too large without her, too quiet in the wrong ways. He tried to reason with himself it was just a misunderstanding, a small ripple that would settle with time, but deep down, he knew better. Some things, once shifted, never returned to their original place. He stared at the faint reflection of the city lights on his office window. Beyond the glass, the world moved on, unbothered, unstoppable. Inside, he sat still, feeling the weight of something he couldn't name, pressing quietly against his chest. It wasn't regret, not yet, but it was close. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, Jonathan realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't sure how to fix what was broken because this time, it wasn't a contract, or a deal, or a system. It was a person. It was her. It started with a knock on the door, short, firm, the kind that carried bad news before a word was spoken. Jonathan looked up from his laptop. His morning had been slow, the air in his office thick with the quiet routine he used to find comfort in. Now it only reminded him of what wasn't being said between him and Emily. He'd been watching her reflection through the glass again, the way her hair caught the light, the way her posture stiffened whenever he walked by. "Come in," he said, his tone as steady as he could manage. It was Daniel, his head of operations, sharp, loyal, one of the few people Jonathan actually trusted. Daniel closed the door behind him, holding a folder that looked far too thin for the weight it carried. "I need you to see this," Daniel said quietly. "It came through our partnership division this morning." Jonathan motioned for him to continue. Daniel opened the folder, laying a single printed proposal on the desk. A firm named Horizon Analytics. He began. "They've been trying to pitch a collaboration with our data systems. The project looks clean on the surface, until you read the fine print." Jonathan scanned the document, his eyes moving fast. "What's wrong with it?" Daniel hesitated. "The project structure would give them access to our client data. Everything. It's framed as a shared innovation model, but it's a direct breach of confidentiality. And..." He stopped, taking a slow breath. "Lucas Miller's name is on it, as project lead." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He didn't look up right away. "Lucas Miller," he repeated, the name tasting bitter. "There's more," Daniel added carefully. "His pitch references someone inside our company. He claims he has a direct contact, someone who's already helping him navigate internal procedures." Jonathan's eyes lifted sharply. Who? Daniel hesitated again, like someone stepping onto thin ice. Emily Carter. The silence that followed was long, the kind that stretches until it hurts. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're sure it's right there?" Daniel said, pointing to a single line in the proposal. He mentions E. Carter, Executive Operations Liaison. It's not an accusation, just a note, but enough to raise flags. Jonathan's fingers tapped once on the edge of the desk. "Has anyone else seen this?" "Only me," Daniel said. "I thought you should be the first to know." Jonathan nodded, dismissing him with a faint gesture. "Leave it with me." When the door closed, the office felt colder. He stared at the paper for a long time, the words blurring together. He knew how business worked. People misrepresented, exaggerated, name-dropped. It could be nothing. A coincidence, a manipulation. But even as he tried to convince himself, something heavier settled in his chest. Lucas. The man who made Emily laugh. The man she trusted enough to dance with. And Emily's name written there, plain as day. He turned his chair toward the glass wall. She was still at her desk, unaware of what was sitting on his. Her face calm, focused, her movements neat, deliberate. The same precision he had always admired. But now, watching her through that invisible barrier, something darker crept in suspicion. The most corrosive form of fear. He hated the thought, hated how quickly it found space to grow. Yet once doubt enters, it doesn't ask permission to stay. For the rest of the morning, he said nothing. But his mind replayed every small moment between them, her hesitation at the gala, the softness in her voice when she spoke about Lucas, her calm after he had confronted her. Could she have known? Could she have been the reason Lucas knew which doors to knock on no? It didn't fit. Emily was loyal, honest to a fault. She had built this company beside him, brick by brick. Still, her name was there. Jonathan closed the folder and pushed it aside. But it didn't leave his thoughts. The unease was constant, like static in the back of his mind. At lunch, when Emily approached to confirm his afternoon meetings, he barely looked at her. "Send me the revised agenda by email," he said, his voice flat. She paused. "Of course." Her tone was polite, but her eyes searched his face for something, a clue, a reason for the sudden distance. He gave her none. The day dragged on, conversations blurred, numbers meant nothing. Every time he saw her, a quiet ache pressed harder against his ribs. Trust, once so effortless, now felt fragile. Late in the afternoon, Daniel returned. "Do you want me to investigate quietly?" Jonathan's instinct was to say yes, to confirm, to control, but the words stayed stuck in his throat. He wasn't ready to hear what the truth might be. "Not yet," he said finally. "Give me time." Daniel nodded and left, closing the door gently behind him. Jonathan sat alone in the fading light. The city outside pulsed with movement, but inside the office, everything was still. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. The doubt that had begun as a whisper now had a voice, one that sounded dangerously like reason. He thought of how easily trust could turn to fear. One line in a document, one unfamiliar name beside hers, one dance. His phone buzzed on the desk. A new message from Emily. "Heading out early tonight. Mom's not feeling well. We'll make up the hours tomorrow. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the reply button. He typed, "Hope she feels better soon," then erased it. Typed again, "Take care of yourself," then erased that too. In the end, he said nothing. He watched from the window as she walked across the parking lot, coat wrapped tight against the wind. A moment later, Lucas's car turned into the street, its headlights cutting through the dim light. Jonathan froze, his heartbeat quickening. The car slowed as it passed her, but didn't stop. Still, the sight was enough. Doubt doesn't need proof to feel real. He turned away from the window, pressing his palms to the edge of his desk. His reflection stared back at him in the dark glass. A man who had spent his life believing that trust was optional, something earned through precision and control. Now, for the first time, he wished it were easier to believe in someone. The folder still lay open beside him, that single name written in black ink, Emily Carter. He closed it slowly, but even as the lid shut with a soft click, the question stayed, not shouted, not even spoken aloud. Just there, quiet as breath. What if she's not who I thought she was? It was late afternoon when Jonathan finally called her in. The light outside had shifted to a pale gold, stretching long shadows across the floor of his office. The hum of the city below felt distant, almost muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emily stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She was holding a folder, her expression calm, professional, though her eyes flickered with quiet concern. She sensed the tension that had been growing, thick and unspoken. "You wanted to see me?" she asked. Jonathan nodded, motioning for her to sit. She didn't. She stood across from him, hands folded loosely in front of her. The distance between them, just a few feet, felt like miles. He hesitated before speaking. For hours, he'd rehearsed how to start this conversation, how to keep it factual, detached. But when he looked at her, the words tangled in his throat. "I received a proposal today," he began, his tone controlled, "from Horizon Analytics." She frowned slightly. "That's the firm Lucas works for, right?" "Yes." His voice hardened just a little. "Your name was in it." Her brows lifted in surprise. "My name?" He pushed the folder toward her. "Right there. E. Carter, Executive Liaison. It implies you're involved." Emily blinked, then let out a quiet, incredulous breath. Involved. She opened the document, scanning the page. "Jonathan, this doesn't even make sense. I haven't spoken to Lucas about anything related to the company. We ran into each other at the gala, that's all." Her tone was steady at first, but he could hear the tremor building underneath. "Then why would he use your name?" Jonathan asked. She looked up at him, stunned. "You think I know?" He didn't answer, just watched her, his expression unreadable, the silence stretched, cold and deliberate. "Jonathan," she said softly, a mix of anger and disbelief creeping into her voice. "You can't seriously think I'd risk everything, this job, my reputation, for him." Still, no answer. His gaze flicked away for a moment, then back to her. "I have to consider every possibility." That sentence, that one line, landed like a blow. Emily's lips parted slightly, her breath catching. "Every possibility," she repeated, her tone low. "Meaning, you think I might be lying?" He shifted, but said nothing. The quiet that followed wasn't neutral anymore. It was sharp, accusatory. She closed the folder slowly and placed it back on his desk. Her hands trembled, though her voice didn't. 3 years, Jonathan. 3 years I've been here before sunrise, leaving after midnight. I've covered for your meetings, fixed your mistakes, stayed through every storm this company's had. And now, one name on a piece of paper, and you think I'd betray you." He wanted to speak, to explain that it wasn't about betrayal. It was about risk, about how easily things could fall apart. But the words didn't come. He just stood there, silent, because silence had always been his shield. Emily laughed, then quietly, bitterly. "You don't even deny it. You don't say no. Of course not. I trust you. You just stand there." Her eyes shone with something between fury and heartbreak. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she asked. "It's not that you doubted me. It's that you couldn't even say it out loud." She took a small step back, her chin lifting in that quiet, defiant way he'd seen before. "You taught me a lot, Jonathan. How to be precise, how to be strong, how to stay calm when people underestimate you. But you never taught me how to stand in front of someone I care about and watch them stop believing in me." He opened his mouth, finally, but still, nothing. Only silence. That silence told her everything she needed to know. She drew in a slow breath, her composure cracking only at the edges. "I thought maybe we understood each other, even without words." Her voice wavered, just slightly. "Turns out, words matter after all." She turned, her hand reaching for the doorknob. For a moment, she paused, eyes still fixed ahead. "You know," she said quietly, "you don't lose people because they change. You lose them because you stop trusting who they already were." Then she left. The door closed with a soft click that sounded far louder than it should have. Jonathan stood there for a long while, staring at the empty space she'd just occupied. The air still carried the faint trace of her perfume, something clean, subtle, grounding. He felt the echo of her words settle deep inside him, heavy and unrelenting. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. The folder sat open on his desk, her name printed in black ink beside the man who had caused all this. He looked at it again, and for the first time, he didn't see evidence. He saw damage, his own. The sun had dipped low enough that the glass walls reflected his face instead of the city outside. He barely recognized himself, the tightness in his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. He closed the folder, but it didn't quiet the noise in his head. He wanted to go after her, to fix it, to say something, anything, but the habit of restraint was stronger than the need to be right. So he stayed, alone, surrounded by everything he'd built, and yet, somehow, less than what he'd been that morning. He leaned against the edge of his desk, eyes fixed on the door she had walked through. Somewhere down the hall, he could hear her footsteps fading quick, sharp, steady, until even that sound disappeared, and in the stillness that followed, Jonathan finally understood. Sometimes silence doesn't protect you. Sometimes it destroys the only thing that ever mattered. The next morning arrived heavy and gray, like the sky itself was unsure if it wanted to begin. The office hummed as usual, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, but beneath the surface, the rhythm felt off. Jonathan sat at his desk, reviewing a report he couldn't seem to absorb. Every line blurred into another, every number meaningless. He hadn't slept much. The echo of Emily's voice from the day before kept circling in his head. You couldn't even say it out loud. When she walked in, he didn't look up at first. He'd half expected her not to come, half hoped. Maybe, because it would have spared them both the awkwardness of facing what had been said. But she did. Of course she did. Emily was nothing if not steady. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice was polite, almost too polite. He nodded without meeting her eyes. "Morning." She placed a stack of papers on his desk, the usual morning routine. But instead of leaving, she hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, "Can we talk?" Jonathan's pen froze in midair. He looked up slowly. Of course. Emily closed the door behind her, the faint click of it cutting the office noise into silence. She stood for a moment, hands clasped, as if searching for the right place to begin. "About yesterday," she said. "I think you deserve to know the truth." He waited. "I did know Lucas," she continued, her tone even measured. "We went to college together. We dated for a while, years ago. It didn't end badly. It just ended. He was ambitious, charming, always chasing something bigger. When I saw him at the gala, I didn't expect it to matter to you or to me." Her voice softened then. "He mentioned his company was working on a proposal. I told him to submit it properly through the corporate channels, like anyone else would. That was it." Jonathan leaned back, watching her. She looked calm, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something fragile, like a thread stretched too tight. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "that you'd been involved." Emily gave a small, humorless smile. "I didn't think my college relationships were part of my employee file." The words stung more than she intended. He flinched slightly, but she didn't apologize. She just exhaled, the breath shaky but steadying. "You think I had something to do with that proposal?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what to think," he admitted. That honesty, simple, raw, landed heavier than any accusation could have. She stepped closer, resting her hands on the back of a chair. "You know me, Jonathan. You've worked beside me for 3 years. You know how I do things. Do you really believe I jeopardize everything we've built?" He looked at her then, truly looked at the exhaustion beneath her composure, at the quiet anger trembling in her voice. He wanted to say no, to tell her that he trusted her, but the words got lost somewhere between fear and pride. "I believe in results," he said instead, almost automatically. She gave a small, sad laugh. "That's exactly what I mean. You only believe what you can measure. Trust isn't on a spreadsheet, so it doesn't count." He stayed silent. She went on, her tone softening but not forgiving. "You always demand perfection, Jonathan, from everyone, from yourself. But people aren't perfect. And sometimes, they just need to be believed in, even when the data doesn't back it up. Her eyes glistened, though she blinked it away. I didn't betray you, but you not trusting me, that hurts more than if I had. He swallowed hard, a tightness rising in his throat. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this wasn't about her. It was about the risk, the company, the evidence. But deep down, he knew she was right. For years, he had built his life like a fortress, walls of control, gates of logic, every emotion cataloged and restrained. He thought that was strength. But now, watching her standing there, her hands trembling as she held her ground, he realized what it really was: fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of needing someone, fear of losing what he couldn't control. Emily's voice broke the silence again, quieter this time. I used to admire that about you. You know how sure you always seemed, how nothing ever got to you. But now I think maybe that's not strength at all. Maybe it's just loneliness wearing a suit. He looked at her, but still couldn't find the words. She sighed and turned away, brushing at her sleeve like she was trying to wipe off the weight of everything between them. I didn't come here to defend myself, she said finally. I just wanted you to hear the truth from me before you decided what to believe. She paused by the door, her hand on the handle. And for what it's worth, I wish you could see me the way you used to. Before all this, Jonathan didn't stop her. He couldn't. When the door closed, the quiet in the room felt different, not sharp like before, but hollow, echoing. He sank back into his chair, her words circling in his mind like a melody that refused to fade. Maybe it's just loneliness wearing a suit. He looked down at the report still open on his desk, the one he'd been pretending to read. The numbers were perfect, balanced, predictable, but they meant nothing now. He leaned back, rubbing his temple, eyes fixed on the door she'd walked through. He could still picture her there, steady, honest, hurt. For the first time in years, he didn't feel in control. And maybe, somewhere deep down, that was exactly what he needed to feel. Outside, the clouds began to break. Sunlight spilled faintly through the blinds, landing on the edge of her empty chair. Jonathan watched it, motionless. The light shifted, bright for a moment, then faded again. He didn't know it yet, but something inside him had begun to move slow, quiet, unstoppable. Because sometimes it takes being misunderstood to finally see yourself clearly. The office was quiet again, but not in the peaceful way it used to be. The kind of quiet now that carried aftershocks, soft but cutting, like glass settling after it breaks. Jonathan sat at his desk long after Emily left that morning. The faint scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, fragile, fleeting. He stared at the door she'd walked through, feeling the echo of every word she'd said. Maybe it's just loneliness wearing a suit. It followed him like a shadow all day. Meetings came and went, conversations blurred into noise. Every voice sounded distant. Even Daniel's updates about contracts or projections couldn't hold his attention. Jonathan nodded where he had to, spoke where he must. But part of him, the part he rarely acknowledged, was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere between guilt and something he didn't dare name. By evening, the building had emptied. The sun dipped low, painting long streaks of orange across the glass. Jonathan's reflection stared back at him, tired eyes, sharp lines, an expression that gave nothing away. He hated mirrors. They told truths no one asked for. He reached for his phone more than once, his thumb hovering over her contact. He could have texted something simple, something that said, "I believe you." But words like that didn't come easily to him. They felt too soft, too exposed. And so, he did what he always did. When the world tilted out of balance, he worked. Hours passed. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. When the clock neared 9, he heard footsteps, light, familiar, approaching slowly. The door opened, and there she was. Emily stood in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, the other clutching her bag. Her hair was loose, her expression unreadable. "I didn't think you'd still be here," she said quietly. I could say the same, he replied. His voice came out softer than he expected. She stepped inside, the sound of her heels barely audible on the carpet. I forgot my notebook, she said. But they both knew that wasn't why she came back. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. You can sit. She hesitated, then shook her head. No, I just came to get it. He watched her cross the room, the faint rhythm of her movement too familiar to ignore. She picked up the small leather-bound notebook from the corner of his desk, the one she used to jot reminders and thoughts. As she turned to leave, he said her name. Emily. She stopped. The sound of it seemed to hang in the air between them. He rose from his chair, unsure of what he meant to say until the words found him. About earlier. He paused, searching for the courage to continue. You were right. She turned slightly, cautious. About what he took a slow breath. About me, about how I see the world, about how I don't trust easily. Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak. He went on, his voice quiet, uneven. I've spent years thinking that control would protect me, that if I kept everything in order, I wouldn't lose anything. But you. He stopped, the sentence catching. You make me realize that maybe control isn't strength. Maybe it's just fear wearing discipline's clothes. Emily stood there, still as the air between them. The city lights flickered behind her, faint and steady. Jonathan's next words came out barely above a whisper. I was jealous. The admission surprised even him. Emily blinked, uncertain she heard right. Jealous? He nodded slowly. Of Lucas, of the way he looked at you. Not because he danced with you, but because he saw something I've been too afraid to see. His gaze met hers. Steady now? The part of you that's real, unfiltered, human. The part that laughs and feels and doesn't care about what anyone thinks. She said nothing, but her breath caught. He took a step closer. The space between them shrinking, though neither moved much. I've spent so long keeping people at a distance that I forgot what it feels like to want to be close, to really see someone. And when I saw you with him, I realized I never gave myself permission to see you that way. Silence settled again, a softer one this time, the kind that doesn't hurt, but still stings. Emily looked at him not angry, not guarded, just tired. Jonathan, she said quietly, you don't have to say that. I do, he replied, because it's true. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Her eyes shimmered, the faintest trace of emotion passing through them. Then she took a breath, steadier than his. You're too used to controlling things, she said gently. Even this, even your own feelings. Maybe that's why you don't know what to do when something doesn't fit the plan. He gave a faint, rueful smile. You're right again. She smiled back just a little. Bittersweet. I usually am. She turned toward the door then, her hand brushing against the handle. For a second, she hesitated. The air between them felt fragile, balanced on the edge of something that might break if touched. And then she said, almost to herself, maybe in another life, we would have met differently. Jonathan's chest tightened. Maybe, he whispered. Emily looked back at him one last time, eyes gentle, voice calm. Good night, Jonathan. He wanted to stop her, to say something, anything, that might undo what had already been done, but the words wouldn't come. The door opened, and she stepped out. Her footsteps faded down the hall, one by one, until only silence remained. Jonathan stood there, the city lights glinting off the glass, his reflection half lost in shadow. For the first time in years, he'd said what he truly felt, and still, it wasn't enough. He sank back into his chair, eyes unfocused, heart pounding softly in his chest. Outside, a car horn sounded, distant and hollow. He looked toward the door where she'd stood, the air still holding her presence. And in that quiet moment, he realized sometimes confession doesn't heal. Sometimes it only shows you how deep the wound really goes. Night had fallen by the time Jonathan got the call. He was still in his office. Lights dimmed. The city spread beneath him like a map of restless stars. His phone buzzed once a message from Daniel, marked urgent. He hesitated for a second, then opened it. Just one line, clipped and cold. You were right. Horizon Analytics breached 2 accounts. Lucas Miller confirmed as lead contact. Jonathan read it twice before the words settled in. The air seemed to thicken, his pulse steady, but slow. He'd been expecting this, hadn't he? The signs were there, the patterns. Still, seeing it in writing brought no satisfaction, only a dull ache that spread quietly through his chest. He leaned back, rubbing his temple. So, Lucas had done it. The man who smiled too easily, who charmed his way through rooms, who made Emily laugh like sunlight breaking through clouds. And Emily. Jonathan closed his eyes. She wasn't part of this. She couldn't be. But the thought that she might be involved, even unknowingly, tightened something inside him. He rose from his chair and walked to the window. The glass reflected his own face back at him, the faint glow of the city outlining the edges of his silhouette. Somewhere down there, people were going home to warmth, to noise, to lives that made sense. His world, by contrast, felt colder than ever. He should tell her. That was the right thing to do. She deserved to know what kind of man Lucas really was, what kind of danger his name carried now. But another voice quieter, heavier, held him still. If you tell her, she'll think you're trying to punish her. To say, I told you so. He didn't want that. He didn't want to be right if being right meant hurting her again. So, he stayed quiet. The next morning, the office moved at its usual pace, but Jonathan felt the shift beneath the surface. Emily came in early, as always, a cup of coffee in hand. She greeted him with polite warmth, the same way she had for years, like nothing had changed. But he knew something had. Between them. There was now a shadow neither of them could see through. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind drifted back to Daniel's message, to the stolen data, to the confirmation that Lucas was at the center of it. Every time he looked up and saw Emily's calm face through the glass, guilt twisted a little deeper. She had trusted him enough to tell her story, to explain the truth, and he, instead of returning, that trust was keeping something from her. By midday, Daniel came by. We've contained it, he said quietly. No major losses, legal's drafting statements, but there's something else. Jonathan looked up. Horizon's internal documents show that Lucas used her name. Daniel said, Emily Carter. He pretended she was endorsing the project. That's how he got in. Jonathan's breath caught. He stared at Daniel. You're sure positive? She's clean. But her name's on everything. It'll spread if we're not careful. Jonathan's fingers tightened around his pen. No one outside this office hears about it. Not yet. Daniel nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. He left quietly, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, Jonathan just sat there, his thoughts tangled between anger and fear. Anger for what Lucas had done. Fear for what this would do to her. He imagined Emily finding out, seeing her name dragged through whispers, her reputation stained by someone else's deceit. He could stop it, he thought, shield her from the fallout, keep her name clear. But that would mean stepping in, making decisions for her again, and she had made it very clear how she felt about that. He stood at the window again, the same one where he'd stood 100 times before. From here, he could see the reflection of her desk, the faint outline of her shoulders as she typed. The sight of her steady, focused, unaware, broke something small and quiet inside him. He wanted to walk out there, to tell her everything, to say, you were right, I should have trusted you, to tell her that Lucas had betrayed them both, and that he was sorry not just for the doubt, but for the silence that came after. But he didn't move, because Jonathan Reed had built a life on restraint, and restraint was a hard habit to unlearn. So he watched her from behind the glass, as if the distance itself were necessary, as if silence could somehow protect her from the truth. The hours passed, the city darkened again, most of the staff went home. Only Emily remained, finishing the last of her reports. When she finally stood to leave, she paused by his door, giving the softest knock. "I left the updated documents on your desk," she said. "Good night, Mr. Reed." He looked up. For a moment, he almost said her name, almost broke the wall between them. But his throat closed around the words. "Good night, Emily." She smiled faintly, polite as ever, and turned to go. When the elevator doors closed behind her, Jonathan sank back into his chair. His hands trembled slightly, though his face stayed composed. On his desk lay Daniel's report, the proof that she was innocent. The proof he'd chosen to keep from her. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and steady. The sound filled the room like an unanswered question. He thought of her walking to her car in that rain, coat pulled tight, unaware of the storm gathering around her name. He could fix it. He knew. One call, one explanation, but instead, he sat there, still. Because some part of him, the part too proud, too afraid, believed that silence was safer than saying the wrong thing. He didn't know yet that silence, left long enough, becomes its own kind of betrayal. The rain hit harder against the glass, streaking the city lights into blurred lines of gold and gray. Jonathan stared at them until his reflection disappeared completely, and for the first time, he couldn't tell if the darkness outside was swallowing the room or just coming from within. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of gray morning that carried tension in the air before anyone said a word. The storm that had been building between them was quiet at first. Too quiet. Emily stood by the conference table, a stack of reports in her hands, her tone calm but distant as she went over the final numbers. Jonathan listened, but not really. His mind wasn't in the figures. It was still stuck in the silence he'd built between them, the one he couldn't seem to undo. Daniel had confirmed the night before that the company's systems were safe now, that Lucas had been reported to authorities. But the story had leaked, and somehow, Emily's name had been dragged into the whispers, not as a suspect, but as a question. People talk, especially when they don't understand. And Jonathan hated that he'd seen it coming and done nothing. When Emily spoke, her voice trembled, just slightly. "They're saying I was part of it. Jonathan. That Lucas used me." He lifted his gaze. "You weren't—" "I know that." "Do you?" she asked. And there it was again, the echo of every word she'd said before. "Because if you did, you wouldn't have stayed silent." He started to respond, but she shook her head, her breath catching. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to walk into a room and see people stop talking? To see their faces shift when they realize you're the one they've been whispering about?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I was trying to protect you." By saying nothing, her tone cracked, not from anger this time, but from something smaller, more human. That's not protection. Jonathan. That's abandonment dressed up as strategy. The words hit harder than he wanted to admit. He stood, pacing slowly, trying to explain what he hadn't been able to before. If I'd said something too soon, it could have made things worse. The board, the media, they'd spin it. I needed proof before I acted. "You always need proof," she said softly. "You can't do anything without it, not even care." The quiet that followed was heavy, suffocating. Jonathan turned away, his hands resting on the edge of his desk. He wanted to tell her everything about how many nights he'd stayed late, trying to keep her name off every report, every file, every conversation that could harm her. How many calls he'd made behind closed doors to erase what shouldn't have been said. But pride and fear were cruel things. They twisted what he meant into something harsher. "I've done more for you than you realize," he said, his tone sharper than intended. Emily blinked, surprised. What's that supposed to mean? He hesitated. He should have stopped there, should have swallowed the words before they reached the air. But emotion, guilt, exhaustion, love, they all collided, and his control cracked. "I paid for your sister's tuition," he said. "For the last 3 years, quietly, anonymously. You never even asked how it was covered, did you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Emily didn't move, didn't blink. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. "You..." What Jonathan froze. The look in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It wasn't even shock. It was betrayal, quiet, cold, and devastating. "You went behind my back," she said slowly, her voice trembling as she processed the words. "You thought you had the right to make that kind of decision for me. I was trying to help," he said quickly, his voice softening. "You were working 2 jobs, taking care of your mother, your sister." "Stop." Her tone cut through his sentence like glass. "You don't get to say that like it justifies anything. You don't get to make choices about my life and then call it kindness." He took a step forward, but she stepped back. "Emily." "No." Her voice cracked, tears glinting in her eyes. "You think because you can fix things with money. You understand what people need, but sometimes what we need isn't saving. It's trust." Her breath hitched as she turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out your life was being managed behind the scenes by someone you thought saw you as an equal?" He stood there, speechless. The room felt smaller now, the air too thick to breathe. He tried to reach for her with words, with silence, with something, but she wouldn't look at him. She drew a slow, shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think love, or whatever this is, gives you the right to decide what's best for me? It doesn't." Jonathan swallowed hard. It wasn't about control. Then what was it? He opened his mouth, but no answer came. The truth that it had been love, fear, guilt all at once sounded too small, too late. She looked at him one last time, her eyes shimmering, fierce despite the tears. "You don't get to call this love, Jonathan, not when it costs me my dignity." Then she turned and walked out, her footsteps steady even as her voice trembled. The door closed behind her, and the silence that followed felt final. Jonathan stood alone, surrounded by the hollow weight of his own good intentions. The sound of his heartbeat filled the room, slow, uneven, like something breaking quietly inside him. He moved to the window, staring at the faint outline of the city lights. The reflection staring back at him was a stranger, a man who'd wanted to protect someone so much that he'd ended up hurting her in the one way she couldn't forgive. He pressed a hand against the cold glass. Outside, rain had started again, soft and steady, the same kind that had fallen the night he chose silence over truth. Now, even truth couldn't fix what silence had broken. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would be the one he replayed in his mind for years to come. The night he finally realized that love, without trust, isn't kindness at all. It's control wearing the wrong name. The office felt different without her. It wasn't just empty, it was quieter in a way that felt alive, like the silence itself remembered her. Jonathan sat at his desk long after everyone had gone home. The lights dimmed, the city stretching beyond the glass in a wash of silver and shadow. Her mug was still there, white porcelain with a small chip near the rim. She always said she liked it because it had character. Now it just sat, untouched, next to a cold ring of coffee she'd left behind. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The scene from that morning replayed again, her face pale with disbelief, her voice trembling when she asked, "You think you have the right to decide for me?" The question hung in the air even now, echoing in the walls. In him, Jonathan had always prided himself on precision. Every deal, every decision, every movement in his life had been calculated. He liked things that could be measured, controlled. That's what made him good at what he did. But love didn't fit into formulas. And somewhere along the way, he'd mistaken control for care. He stood and walked slowly around the room, his hand brushing the back of the chair where she used to sit during late nights, reviewing files beside him. He could still picture her there, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled, humming softly under her breath while typing. It wasn't the sound itself he missed. It was the quiet ease that came with it. On the shelf behind his desk sat a small plant, one she'd brought in years ago. "Every office needs something alive," she'd said. He had laughed back then, told her he didn't do plants, but she left it there anyway. And somehow, it had survived. He reached out, touching one of its leaves. It felt fragile, but firm, just like her. He thought, strong, but not hardened, steady, but never cold. Jonathan sank back into his chair, staring at the faint reflection of the city lights in the window. He tried to make sense of where it had gone wrong, not just between them, but within him. The truth was, he had loved her in the only way he knew how, by trying to fix her world, to protect her from its sharp edges. But maybe what she needed wasn't a shield. Maybe she just needed someone who believed she could stand on her own. He thought of her laugh, the rare kind that slipped out when she forgot herself. The way she always carried too much on her shoulders, but still managed to show up, steady and kind. The way she'd once told him that strength didn't mean control, it meant compassion. He'd brushed it off then. Now, it was the only thing he could hear. The clock ticked softly behind him. Time moved, indifferent. Jonathan opened his laptop, scrolling through old emails, project notes, calendar invites, reports, all sterile, all efficient. But then he found one she'd sent months ago, short and warm. Don't forget to eat. The world won't end if you take a break. He'd smiled when he got it, but never replied. Now, that line felt like a whisper from a past version of his life. He closed the laptop. The silence pressed in again. And this time, he didn't fight it. He let it wash over him, the regret, the understanding, the strange, hollow tenderness that remained. He'd lost her, not because of betrayal or lies, but because of something quieter, the inability to let someone simply be. He realized then how much of his life had been built around control. Every success, every dollar, every decision had been about staying safe from chaos, from loss, from feeling too deeply. But control, he finally saw, came with a cost. And that cost was connection. The very thing he'd tried to preserve had become the thing he'd destroyed. He exhaled, long and slow, the kind of breath that comes when you stop fighting what's already gone. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed, then faded into the distance. The city went on, unaware, unbothered, while he sat there in the soft hum of fluorescent light, surrounded by everything he'd built, and nothing that mattered. For the first time, he wished he could trade it all, every deal, every win, every perfectly controlled outcome, for one more chance to look her in the eyes and tell her, I see you, not what you need to be, not what I want you to be, just you. But second chances didn't work that way. Not when trust had been broken. He reached for her mug, running his thumb along the chipped edge. It was such a small flaw, yet it made the cup distinct, memorable. Maybe that was the point. Maybe everything worth loving had a crack somewhere. And maybe real love wasn't about patching those cracks, but learning to hold them gently. Jonathan set the mug down and leaned back, eyes heavy. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe she'd quit. Maybe she'd never speak to him again. But he knew this much. The version of himself that thought love meant fixing someone had to go. The rain had stopped outside. The air felt clearer somehow, the city lights sharp again through the glass. He stood, straightening his jacket, glancing once more at the empty chair across from his desk. It wasn't just a chair anymore. It was a reminder of what trust looked like when you forgot how to give it. He turned off the light and walked to the door. The echo of his footsteps filled the space where her voice used to be. Before leaving, he glanced back one last time. The plant, the mug, the soft glow of the skyline. All of it still there, and in that quiet, for the first time, Jonathan understood the real cost of control. It wasn't failure. It was losing the chance to be human with someone who already saw the good in you. That night, the city outside was restless. Rain had stopped hours ago, but the street still shimmered with its reflection lights rippling across puddles, cars whispering past like tired ghosts. Inside the office tower, only one floor was lit. Jonathan's. He sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines left on standby. His tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, papers lay scattered across the desk. But he wasn't reading anymore. The numbers, the schedules, the controlled order of his world, none of it meant anything tonight. His mind kept circling back to the sound of her voice, breaking on that one question. You think you have the right to decide for me. He had no defense left, only regret. For the longest time, Jonathan just sat there, elbows resting on the desk, staring at the empty chair across from him. Her chair, the one she used to claim without asking. The one that somehow made the office feel less like a fortress and more like a space where breath could move. The building was nearly silent now, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of rainwater dripping from the roof. He exhaled slowly and reached for the small drawer at the corner of his desk, the one where he kept the things he didn't show anyone. A fountain pen, thick, cream-colored stationery. He hadn't written a letter by hand in years, maybe decades. He placed the paper in front of him and sat still for a while, the pen unmoving between his fingers. Words had always come easily when they were about contracts, strategies, control. But this was different. This wasn't about control. It was about surrender. He began to write. Emily. He paused after her name, letting the ink dry a little. I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you'll even want to, but I need to say what I should have said long before now. I need to tell you the truth, not the kind that fits into numbers and logic, but the kind that hurts to admit. He stopped again, staring at the words. The paper looked too white, too clean for what he wanted to confess. He continued anyway. I helped your sister because I saw you working yourself into exhaustion. Because every night, you stayed long after everyone had gone home, and still managed to smile the next morning. You carried more than anyone I've ever known, and I thought stupidly that if I could take even one weight off your shoulders, I should. But I never asked if that's what you wanted. I just acted. I made it about what I needed to feel useful, in control, right. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper filled the silence. You were right. I don't know how to trust without trying to fix. I've spent my life believing that love means protection, that caring means control. But I see now that it isn't. It's faith. It's letting someone stand, even if you're terrified they'll fall. I didn't trust you enough to let you be strong, and that's my failure, not yours. He paused again, the pen hovering over the paper. A drop of ink pooled where he hesitated. I've watched you for 3 years. Every decision you've made, every quiet act of kindness you thought no one noticed I did. I saw it all. The way you'd leave notes for the interns to keep them from feeling invisible. The way you'd take the blame for mistakes that weren't yours just to protect someone else. The way you'd smile, even on days you were breaking inside. You think no one sees you, but I did. Emily, I saw you. Jonathan leaned back, his chest tight. He looked around the room at the faint trace of her presence still lingering in the air and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what he'd lost. He bent forward again and wrote the last few lines slowly, carefully, like he was afraid they might dissolve if he rushed them. I'm sorry, for the silence, for the control, for the way I made you feel small when all I ever meant was to protect you. I don't expect forgiveness or even understanding, but I want you to know that I loved you, not the idea of you, not the version I tried to shape just you, as you are, and maybe that's the one thing I got right. He signed his name, simple and quiet, Jonathan. The ink glistened faintly under the desk lamp. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it. For a long moment, he just held it there, feeling the texture of the paper beneath his thumb thin, but solid. He stood, his chair creaking softly behind him, and walked across the room to her desk. The space was neat as always. Her notebook lay where she'd left it, next to a pen aligned perfectly with the edge. He placed the envelope there, right on top, and smoothed it flat. The room felt impossibly still. He lingered for a few seconds, his hand resting on the back of her chair. I'm sorry, he murmured aloud, though no one could hear him. The words came out rough, uneven, but honest. Outside, The wind shifted, rattling the windows gently. The city seemed to breathe with him, long, slow, aching breaths. Jonathan turned off the lamp. The soft glow faded, leaving only the faint light from the skyline spilling across the floor. He took one last look at the letter, at the quiet space where her presence still lingered, then walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he paused. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man in control. He felt human, vulnerable, real. He stepped out into the hallway, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Behind him, in the dim light of the office, the letter waited a confession too late to change the past, but maybe just in time to soften what came next. And outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the city, pale, uncertain, but new. Morning came gray and tense, the kind of morning when even the air felt heavy, as if the world knew something was about to break. Jonathan arrived earlier than usual, his steps echoing down the long corridor toward the boardroom. He hadn't slept. The letter he left on her desk still haunted him, every line, every word, every truth written too late. But now wasn't the time for sentiment. There were consequences waiting. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with low murmurs, suits, screens, the faint clink of coffee cups, a storm of polite hostility. They'd all heard about the data breach, about Horizon Analytics, about Lucas Miller, and about Emily Carter's name being tied to it. Jonathan could feel it in the way their eyes followed him, cautious and sharp. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cufflinks. Control even now was his armor. When the meeting began, the chairman's voice carried the cold precision of accusation. "Mr. Reed, we've reviewed preliminary reports. It appears the breach originated from a proposal endorsed internally. The name listed was one of your senior staff." Jonathan's hands tightened slightly around the pen in front of him. "I'm aware," he said. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Are you also aware," another member interjected, "that the media has already connected her to Lucas Miller? This situation has the potential to undermine investor trust." He nodded once, slowly. "Yes. And your position on this?" Jonathan looked down at his notes, not because he needed them, but because it gave him a second to breathe. Then he lifted his head. "My position," he said carefully, "is that the responsibility is mine." The room went still. He could feel the shift in the air, surprise, confusion, maybe even admiration from a few. But he kept his tone even. "Emily Carter acted under my leadership. Any decision tied to that proposal, any error in judgment, comes back to me. I take full accountability." The chairman frowned. "Mr. Reed, are you suggesting I'm stating," Jonathan interrupted softly, "that she is not to be questioned further? If a name must carry blame, let it be mine." A long silence followed. Then came the murmurs again, softer this time, circling the room like smoke. Jonathan sat back, his pulse steady though his chest felt hollow. It was the only thing he could do for her, now protect her name, even if it meant his own would take the fall. He could live with that. He couldn't live with knowing he'd let them destroy her. Someone cleared their throat. Still, this needs to be investigated properly. We can't. The door opened, every head turned, and there she was. Emily stood in the doorway, calm but resolute, a folder clutched tightly in her hand. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Jonathan for only a second before she addressed the board. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. "But before any more decisions are made, you need to see this." She walked forward, the sound of her heels breaking through the stunned silence. Jonathan's breath caught when he saw her, the same composure he'd always admired, now sharper, steadier, stronger. She set the folder down on the table and opened it. "This," she said, "is correspondence between Lucas Miller and 2 external consultants he hired to breach the company's servers. Emails, payment records, everything." A few members leaned forward, scanning the documents. The color drained from one of their faces. Emily continued. "He used my name on the proposal to gain access. He knew Jonathan trusted me. He counted on that. She paused, her gaze flicking briefly toward Jonathan before returning to the group. But I've also included the report from IT showing my system credentials were never used during the breach. I was never involved. Not for a second. No one spoke. Jonathan sat frozen, every word sinking into him like sunlight breaking through cloud. She'd come back not for him, but for the truth, for her dignity. And somehow, in doing so, she'd saved him too. The chairman finally exhaled. "This is substantial evidence," he said. "If this checks out, it will," she said simply. I made sure. Jonathan's chest tightened. Pride, guilt, relief. It all swirled into something wordless. As the board members exchanged glances, discussing next steps, Emily stepped back slightly, her eyes meeting his at last. For a brief moment, neither said a word. They didn't need to. The meeting continued, formalities filling the room, but Jonathan barely heard them. He watched as she stood there composed, radiant in a way that wasn't about appearance but about presence. The same woman he'd underestimated, misunderstood, and still loved. When the session finally adjourned, people began filing out, murmuring apologies, relief, half-hearted attempts to save face. The room emptied until it was just the two of them. She didn't move. Neither did he. "You shouldn't have taken the blame," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "I had to," he replied. His voice was low, rough around the edges. "You didn't deserve what they were saying." Emily looked down for a moment, then back at him. "I didn't come here to prove you wrong," she said. "I came because it wasn't fair to either of us." He took a step closer. "You saved me," he said. She gave a small, tired smile. "No, I saved the truth. You'll have to save yourself." Her words lingered between them, gentle but unyielding. She gathered the folder and turned toward the door. Jonathan wanted to stop her, to thank her, to apologize again. But he knew that sometimes words, even the right ones, could ruin the quiet strength of a moment like this. So he let her go. As she reached the doorway, she paused, her voice soft. "I read your letter." Jonathan froze. She didn't look back, but her tone changed warmer, faintly trembling. "You write better than you speak." And then she left. The door closed behind her, leaving him alone again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was lighter, different. Jonathan sank back into his chair, exhaling slowly. The morning sun had broken through the clouds outside, flooding the boardroom with pale gold light. He looked at the space where she had stood, where she'd faced them all calm, brave, unflinching. She had saved him, yes. But in doing so, she had also shown him what love really looked like. Not control, not protection, but strength quiet and free. And for the first time, Jonathan didn't try to control the feeling that came with that truth. He just let it wash over him. The building was almost empty when Jonathan finally stepped out of the boardroom. The chaos of the morning had quieted. The storm of voices and judgment had faded into the kind of silence that follows resolution. He felt drained, but lighter somehow. The weight he'd been carrying, the guilt, the shame, the silence had shifted, not gone, but no longer suffocating. He walked back to his office, the echo of his footsteps steady against the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of rain again. Though the skies outside were clear, he thought about how strange that was, how even the world seemed to hold memory in its own quiet way. When he opened the door, she was there. Emily stood by his desk, her back half turned toward him. His letter lay open in her hands. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and the faint light from the window touched the edge of her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jonathan froze in the doorway, the sight of her unexpected and disarming. Then, softly, she folded the letter and set it down on the desk. "You still don't know how to say sorry the easy way, do you?" she said quietly, without looking at him. Her tone wasn't sharp. It was calm, almost amused, but beneath it, Something gentler lingered. Jonathan's throat tightened. I guess not. She turned to face him, eyes meeting his. There was no anger there now, just a kind of tired warmth. You should try it sometime, she said. It's less painful than writing 3 pages at 2 in the morning. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. You read it twice, she said. Once as your employee, once as someone who used to matter to you. He nodded, unsure what to do with his hands, his voice, his guilt. And which one forgave me? Emily smiled faintly, crossing her arms. The second one, she said after a pause. But only a little. The air between them softened then. Not cleared, not yet, but warmer, like the first touch of sun after days of gray. Jonathan took a slow step forward. I didn't expect you to come back, he said. I didn't either, she admitted. But then I thought, if I can fight a room full of executives to defend the truth, I can face one man to finish a conversation. He smiled. That sounds like you? She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You really meant everything in that letter. Yes. Even the part where you said you love me. He hesitated only for a heartbeat, especially that part. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that allows 2 people to simply breathe in the same air. Emily looked down for a moment, tracing her fingers along the edge of the desk. You know, she said softly, I spent so long thinking you didn't see me. That to you, I was just reliable, efficient, replaceable. His chest ached at her words. You were never replaceable, Emily. I know that now, she said, lifting her gaze to meet his again. But it took a lot to get here. He nodded slowly, the truth of it cutting deep. You deserve better from me. Maybe, she said with a quiet shrug, or maybe I just needed you to make your mistakes, so you'd finally learn what love really means. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. And what does it mean letting someone be? She said, not fixing them, not protecting them from themselves, just being there without needing to control the ending. Her voice was steady, her words simple, but they sank into him like a slow tide. Jonathan took a small breath, his next words tentative. Can I make it up to you? Emily's lips curved, not a smile, not exactly, but something close. You can try, she said. He hesitated, then said, have dinner with me. Her brows lifted slightly. Dinner? Yes, he said. Not as your boss, not as some man trying to apologize with grand gestures. Just me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked toward the window, looking out at the city below the skyline, painted gold by the fading sun. Do you even know how to be just you? She asked. I'm starting to figure it out, he said quietly. She turned back toward him, and for the first time in months, he saw her truly smile, soft, unguarded, alive. That's a good start, she said. He stepped closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of her perfume, the same one that used to linger on his jacket after late nights working side by side. So, he said gently, is that a yes? Emily looked up at him, the light catching the edge of her eyes. You're persistent, she murmured. I've been told that's one of my faults, he replied. Sometimes, she said, persistence can be good. Their eyes held a moment stretched between forgiveness and something that could almost be called hope. Then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Dinner? Then? He exhaled, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Dinner. She picked up her bag, pausing by the door. But you're choosing a place that doesn't serve boardroom food, she said. No suits, no titles, just 2 people who forgot how to be human for a while. Jonathan chuckled softly. Deal? She nodded and stepped out, leaving him there for a moment, longer, standing by the window, feeling something rare and unfamiliar, not certainty, not control, just peace. Outside, the sky had turned the color of amber and fading rose. The city lights began to flicker on, one by one, like small promises that the night wouldn't be empty. He watched her through the glass as she crossed the lobby below, her figure moving steadily through the glow of the evening. And in that moment, Jonathan realized forgiveness isn't always a grand declaration. Sometimes, it's as quiet as someone saying yes when they could have walked away forever. He turned off the lights and followed her out, the sound of his footsteps no longer echoing but blending, softly, with hers. The lights of the ballroom shimmered like liquid gold, spilling warmth across marble floors and crystal glasses. Music drifted softly through the air, not loud, not demanding, just enough to make people sway. It was the company's 20th anniversary, a celebration of growth, of resilience, of time. But for Jonathan Reed, it wasn't about the speeches or the applause. It was about the quiet moment, waiting somewhere between the crowd and memory. He stood near the balcony, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand. The years had softened him in ways success never could. His hair was a little grayer now, his edges a little less sharp, but his eyes, once cold, calculating, held a kind of peace, the kind that only comes when a man finally stops fighting the person he used to be. Across the room, laughter rippled through clusters of executives and their guests. And then, without warning, he saw her, Emily. She stood near the center of the room, radiant beneath the golden lights, not in the quiet, serious way she used to be, but alive, really alive. Her dress was simple, navy blue with a soft shimmer, her hair gathered loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She was talking with someone from the marketing team, her smile gentle and unguarded. Jonathan felt something in his chest, not the ache of longing, not the weight of regret, but a quiet warmth, like recognition. 2 years. That's how long it had been since that night, the dinner that turned into a walk. The walk that turned into 1,000 conversations that slowly rebuilt what was once broken. 2 years since he stopped being her boss, stopped being the man who controlled everything, and started learning what it meant to simply be with someone. He didn't rush toward her. He waited, watching as she excused herself from the conversation and turned as if she had felt his gaze across the room. Their eyes met, and then she smiled. It wasn't the cautious, polite smile of the past. It was the kind that spoke of shared history, of forgiveness fully lived through, of love that no longer needed to prove itself. She walked toward him, her steps unhurried, confident. "Mr. Reed," she said softly when she reached him, her tone teasing but warm. "You look almost relaxed." He chuckled, shaking his head. "It's Jonathan. You know that." "I know," she said, eyes glinting. "I just like reminding you that you used to make everyone call you Mr. Reed." "Old habits," he said. "Broken habits," she corrected. He smiled, setting the glass aside. "You look—" He paused, searching for a word that didn't sound like a compliment rehearsed too many times. "Happy?" "I am," she said simply. "It's been a good year." He nodded. "It shows." They stood there for a moment, just taking in the easy quiet between them. The music shifted a slower melody now, something soft and nostalgic, the kind of song that fills spaces words can't reach. Emily tilted her head. "You remember this song?" He listened. The same melody that had played the night of that first gala, the night he'd watched her dance with another man and felt something he couldn't name. "Yes," he said quietly. "I remember." Her eyes softened. "So do I." For a second, time folded in on itself. 2 years, 2 people, 2 versions of the same dance waiting to rewrite what had once gone wrong. Jonathan extended a hand toward her. "Dance with me." She looked at it, his hand, open, steady, and then met his gaze. "You're not afraid this time." He smiled faintly. "Terrified," he said, "but not enough to miss my chance again." She let out a quiet laugh, one that melted the last of the distance between them. And then, without hesitation, she placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the floor together, moving among the slow-turning couples. The light caught in her hair as they swayed, her hand resting against his shoulder, his other hand gently at her waist. The first few beats were careful, as if both were remembering how to move in rhythm again. Then something shifted, a breath, a heartbeat. They found each other's pace. Jonathan looked down at her, at the calm curve of her smile, and whispered, "It's strange. This feels different." "It is," she said softly, "because this time, we're not pretending." He nodded. The truth of it sat quietly between them. No masks, no unspoken rules, just two people, older, steadier, finally moving together instead of around each other. The music swelled gently, strings carrying through the air like a sigh. Jonathan tightened his hand slightly around hers. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think control meant safety, that if I could just plan everything, I'd never lose anything that mattered." And now she asked, "Now," he said, "I know that the best things can't be controlled, only chosen, every day." Emily smiled. "Then keep choosing?" "I do," he said. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder. Around them, the room blurred into motion laughter, light, the sound of champagne glasses clinking, but in that small circle of music and touch, everything else fell away. When the song ended, neither stepped back immediately. They lingered, caught in that quiet after the last note, the kind of silence that feels almost holy. Emily finally looked up. "You've changed," she said. He smiled, just a hint of it. "You helped." "Maybe," she said, "but the work that was all you." He shook his head gently. "No, the work was us." For a heartbeat. Her eyes shimmered, then she whispered, "You always did figure things out a little late." He laughed softly. "True, but at least I figured this out in time." She smiled, leaning closer. "In time for what?" He looked at her, his voice quiet but certain. "For our second dance." And just like that, the band began another song, slow, steady, familiar. They didn't move right away. They just looked at each other, as if the first dance all those years ago had finally found its answer. Then Jonathan guided her back into motion, their steps easy, their laughter soft. Around them, the world went on lights glimmering, people talking, time moving, but for that moment. They were suspended in something timeless. Two people, two dances, one truth learned the hard way that love doesn't need to be perfect to be real. The music faded slowly into applause. Jonathan looked down at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming back." Emily smiled, her eyes bright. "I never really left." And as they stood there under the golden lights, the crowd moving around them like gentle waves, Jonathan realized this wasn't the ending of their story. It was the quiet beginning they'd both been too afraid to imagine. The ballroom was nearly empty when the music stopped, chairs half-turned, glasses forgotten on linen-draped tables. The kind of stillness that follows joy, gentle, complete, like the air itself was exhaling. Jonathan stood by the window, looking out at the city. The night stretched wide, scattered with the shimmer of streetlights and passing cars. He could see their reflections in the glass, his and Emily's standing side by side, quiet and unhurried. No tension now, no walls, just a still peace between two people who had walked through fire and come out softer. Emily's hand rested lightly on the edge of the window frame. She didn't say anything for a long while. She didn't need to. 2 years ago, she said finally, her voice almost a whisper, "I didn't think we'd ever dance again." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the city below. 2 years ago. I didn't know how to ask. Her laughter low, warm filled the room like music all over again. "You've learned," she said. "I'm still learning." Outside, a cab's headlights passed across the glass, lighting their faces for just a moment before fading into the dark. Emily turned to him, her expression soft. "That's the point, isn't it?" she said. "You don't ever stop learning how to love someone. You just get better at listening." Jonathan looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He nodded slowly. "I wish I'd listened sooner." "Maybe," she said, tilting her head. "But maybe you needed the silence first to know what words are worth saying." Her tone wasn't forgiving. It was kind, and that kindness more than anything felt like grace. He reached for her hand then. Not the way he used to, not out of habit or fear of losing her, but gently, open-handed, like an offering. She took it, her fingers curling around his with easy certainty. They didn't speak again. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt alive, the kind of silence that holds space, not distance. Time passed quietly after that. The lights dimmed, the hall emptied, and the faint hum of night took over. When they finally left, Jonathan walked beside her no longer. The man who led from ahead, but one who kept pace. Outside, the air was cool and clean. A light breeze swept down the street, carrying the scent of rain on stone. She pulled her shawl closer, and without thinking, he lifted a hand to help. She smiled, but didn't stop him. They walked that way slowly, side by side, until they reached the curb. He turned to her. Emily. She looked up. He hesitated for just a moment. Then, softly, he said, "Thank you." For what? For not giving up on the part of me that didn't know how to love, right? Her eyes shone, not with tears, but something steadier. "You found it," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded. The city buzzed quietly around them, laughter from a restaurant nearby, a car horn in the distance, life going on. But inside him, there was only stillness. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt unafraid of silence, because now, it wasn't emptiness, it was peace. They said goodnight beneath the soft glow of the street lamp. No promises, no grand words, just a look that said everything that needed saying. And as she walked away, her figure fading into the quiet rhythm of the street, Jonathan stayed where he was, breathing in the night air, feeling something close to gratitude rise in his chest. He thought about all the years he'd spent trying to measure his worth in control, in perfection, in outcomes, and how, in the end, it wasn't the grand gestures or the victories that mattered. It was the courage to be honest, the humility to admit he'd been wrong, the grace to love without ownership. He smiled to himself, just a small, quiet smile. When he turned to leave, the rain began soft at first, a hush against the pavement. He didn't rush to avoid it. He let it fall cool, cleansing, soaking into his suit, into his hair, into the kind of man he had become. And somewhere between the sound of the rain and the echo of her laughter still lingering in his memory, he understood something simple, something he'd chased his whole life without knowing. We don't lose people because of the mistakes we make. We lose them because of the words we never said. He stopped walking, looked up at the night sky, the raindrops glinting under the streetlight like falling stars. Then, softly to the rain, to the city, to himself, he whispered, "I'm listening now." And that was enough, because sometimes healing doesn't come with answers. It comes with stillness, with truth, with the courage to speak before it's too late. The camera would linger there if this were a film, on the quiet figure of a man standing in the rain, a faint smile on his lips, the city alive around him. And the voice, warm, steady, would return, wrapping around the story like a final breath. We don't lose the ones we love because we fail. We lose them because we stay silent when love asks us to speak. So, speak before the moment passes, before the light fades, before silence becomes goodbye, and then only rain, and the soft sound of footsteps walking home. Sometimes, love isn't lost in grand betrayals or loud mistakes. It slips away quietly, through the words we never say and the feelings we hide behind pride. Jonathan and Emily's story reminds us that silence, though peaceful on the surface, can build walls higher than anger ever could. True connection asks for courage, the courage to be honest, to admit when we're wrong, and to let others see the softer parts of us we often protect. In life, we all carry our own versions of control, the need to manage outcomes, to stay safe. But love doesn't live in control. It grows in trust, in forgiveness, and in the small moments when we dare to speak our truth. For those of us who have loved and lost, it's never too late to reach out, to say what's been held inside for too long. Because in the end, it's not the perfect words that matter. It's the willingness to speak from the heart while there's still time to be heard. Thank you, dear listener, for spending this quiet moment with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please take a second to like this video, share it with someone who might need its warmth, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that remind us all of love, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of the human heart. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and keep shining.